Alright, so, last time we checked this out, it was episode 11. Now, because of the way I'm doing my schedule now, I've decided to just make an executive decision on this. I'm not going to do the Q&As afterwards unless people actually message, like leave comments, stuff like that, letting me know this is one they want to see. Because this one is almost 2.5 hours long, and the Q&A is about an hour of it. So I'm not going to be doing that unless you guys really want to see that. In any case, we're going to go ahead and get started on this. Episode 12, A Storm of Sabers. Now, in the last episode, and the episode before that, it was being set up that 50,000 Jedi were going to be here. Oh wow, what is that on my mouth? Like, I cut myself shaving. Apparently nobody told me. Anyhow, here we go. Oh, I remember this trailer. That trailer hurts your feelings. Yay.
From dust.
One of my favorite remixes of this trailer was done to This Is War. Like, she just whipping that ass. You know, you can't argue with this. This is an ass whooping. Just boom. Just whoop that ass. Anyhow. I like it. I like it. I can tell he sped up the same. I can tell he sped this up a good bit, but at the same time, it doesn't distract from what he did here. Very nice.
From dust.
Yes.
Anakin crept along the alleyway, hood drawn up around his face, obscuring his features. It was frigid, almost cold enough to snow, which meant that it was the most miserable temperature possible for the weather he was in. Frigid, oily drops pattered against his slick robe in an inconsistent drizzle. Well, perhaps weather was the wrong term. After all, it was hardly rain that he was being coated in. Looking up, tens, maybe hundreds of massive graded platforms faced skyward, and an equal amount lingered below him, visible through the holes in the graded platform he himself stood on. Buildings had been fitted onto these grates, each one rising to a variable height, all the way up to the next grate, with some connecting to the buildings above or below them. Each grate contained a small city in its own right, and people moved, worked, and lived on each segment as naturally as anyone might on the lower levels of Coruscant. Crowds of dirty void dwellers roamed down the broad avenues, walking on foot or conveyed on some vehicle. Priests in red robes, their bodies disfigured with rough, pervasive augmentations, wore large floating harnesses and rings, levitating above the crowds, performing various tasks of maintenance on the varied systems of the ship. The entire area smelled like stale air and human bodies, the unwashed kind, and Anakin did not want to hazard a guess as to just what was composing the inconsistent but ever-present drizzle which coated him more and more with each passing moment.
Welcome to the
Jedi looked around, checking to make sure the coast was relatively clear before waving his men forward. It was just him, Wrecker, Crosshair, Tech, Hunter, and R2. Moving with such a small team had allowed them to evade the security forces sent to their boarding craft, and with little effort they had moved deep enough into the ship to reach this populated area. The clones and droid rushed across the smaller street which separated them, coming into Anakin's alley and hefting weapons, each cloaked as well. "This is a warship?" Hunter asked as he came up beside Anakin. The Jedi nodded. "Yeah, one of their smaller ones," he added, peeking around a corner into the main street. "No kiddin'?" Hunter asked, kneeling down and tapping the grated floor. "From what I can tell, there's at least 30,000 people living in here. Maybe more," he said with a sniff.
Probably more.
"They drag all these people to war? What happens if the ship gets attacked or blown up?"
Bye.
asked Wrecker. No one answered verbally, but Crosshair hefted his sniper rifle and drew his finger across his own throat, pairing the act with a choking sound. Wrecker's eyes widened. "Whoa, wow, that's pretty hardcore," Wrecker
Yeah,
said.
no shit.
"Wrecker, rein it in, stay focused," said Hunter. The huge clone smirked and nodded. "We need to pick up the pace, Hunter. Ahsoka and Rex are fighting next door, and I'm sure they are drawing most of the attention. We need to break into the bridge and make sure they have no way to access the bomb on an axis, with Trench's ship or not," Anakin said. Hunter stood, shaking his head. "I know, sir, but this place is vast and not built very intuitively. Halls are blocked, lifts are broken. I was hoping that by heading towards a larger, empty space, navigation would become clearer, but that's not the case."
Welcome to hell.
He trailed off, seeming to hear something before snapping around and aiming his blaster at the far end of the alley. Standing there was a hunched man, or was he a machine? Both, and fully a monster besides. He was mauled by metallic augmentations all over his body, head, neck, everywhere. His flesh was a tortured red mass of metal and unwilling skin and muscle. Both eyes gone, replaced with large, red lenses that had been shoved into the eye sockets. Sockets which still wept dirty pink tears which dripped from its chin. All weapons snapped up to face it, and R2 whirred and moved behind Anakin.
Servitor.
All praise be his.
The man-machine said as it staggered into the alley. It had a large, hunched back, and its arms were both replaced,
Servitor.
the right with a large claw, and the left with a club-like protuberance of stained metal.
If you don't know what a servitor is, let me give you a brief education. A servitor is a criminal who has been lobotomized and massively surgically augmented until such time as his service to the Imperium in the form of his sentence is carried out, or until he falls over and dies. Usually the fall over and dies has happened first. You can be turned into a servitor for sneezing in the wrong direction sometimes. Depends on your planet.
Flies buzzed about its stinking, nearly rotting form, covered only by filthy rags and sheets of long, thin paper which hung from red wax seals, each thickly coated in the scrolled religious texts of the Dia. It moved forward steadily, but slowly, appearing to have no other speed. "Should we?" Crosshair asked, looking towards Hunter, but it was Anakin who answered. "No, wait. Don't shoot it. I don't sense anything. No hostility," he whispered. "No awareness at all," he added a moment later. All the while, the thing continued to lurch forward, moving towards them, metal feet thumping down one after the other as it neared them. Closer and closer and closer it came.
All praise.
It said. It's getting kinda close, Wrecker said, still aiming at the thing. You shoot that thing, and it will give us away. Just move, nice and slow. Anakin said back. It got closer and closer, moving directly towards Crosshair, the closest one. But Crosshair did not move. He only raised and sighted his rifle, mechanical legs squeaking slightly as he adjusted his stance.
Must be expunged.
It droned, now almost in Crosshair's face. Crosshair, move, Hunter ordered, his voice low and strained. It stepped almost into the raised barrel of Crosshair's rifle, raising one augmented arm, the claw there opening sluggishly. Crosshair smoothly but slowly moved to the left of the thing as it reached forward, his barrel hovering inches from its face and head. Its claws reached into a fitted slot into the wall behind Crosshair, and out slid a stinking refuse container. Its other arm reached in, the club-like head of its limb revealed to be a powerful suction device, which it used to slurp up the partial sewage. Its hunchback inflated, getting larger and larger until it stopped, a flame flicking to life at the end of the same arm that had been used for the draining. It billowed out a flame into the container, sterilizing it before sliding it back into the wall.
Yep.
Oh, task in his name are worthy.
It moaned as it turned away from the wall and began to walk to the next alley and the next container. They all watched after it, even remaining silent and vigilant as it opened the wall canister in the next alley over from theirs, doing the same, its hump swelling and stinking even more grotesquely. Was that supposed to be a person? Tech asked. Anakin, paler now than he had been before, shook his head. That used to be a person. I have no idea what it is now, he said. R2-D2 beeped in word, and Anakin nodded. What'd he say? Asked Wrecker. A droid, said the Jedi. Huh? Asked the clone. R2 says that it, whatever it was...
I'm kind of shocked that they managed to get R2 on this ship and he hasn't been shot instantaneously.
It's now a droid. Maybe less, Anakin clarified. This place is a horror show, Crosshair said, not sounding nearly as displeased as his words would imply. Then let's bring the curtains down, said Hunter. General, we can't rely on my spatial awareness alone if we're going to navigate up to the bridge in time to aid Captain Rex. We need a guide, willing or not. Anakin nodded, rubbing his chin before suddenly smiling. Okay, I've got an idea.
But I got lonely. Meanwhile, on board, the Hell Smasher. I'm loving how in this, and apparently this is from the Clone Wars as well, Anakin, the one thing I did not like about the prequels more than anything else was Anakin was made out to be childish, naive, just sort of like there was no strategy about them, there was no tactics, there was no nothing like that. But I'm liking what we're getting here, because the person that was Anakin in the prequels, I could never see as Vader. But that's neither here nor there.
Freaking kill him! Shoot it! Shoot it!
Screeched the augmented warrior. Half his face was cast in rigid metal, iron teeth exposed, red lenses filling the metal socket of the skull-like side of his head. But the other half was all too human, scowling and paling in a volatile combination of uncompromising fury and existential fear. Before him, 2 men of lesser rank aimed their massive slug throwers, their multiple barrels whining as they began to spin like primitive imitations of proper rotary blasters. Obi-Wan's speed increased, leaving them only a second or 2 left when their weapons actually started firing. The Jedi Master narrowed his eyes as he saw the shots coming, fast, very fast, and not blockable. He answered them by running to the left, narrowly avoiding the twin streams of fire as he sped towards them up the cylindrical hall. The 2 gunners were nothing if not persistent, gritting their teeth as they moved their weapons to chase, lines of fire dragging after Obi-Wan, forcing him further and further left, sandwiching him between the wall and the closing hail of bullet-borne death that was pursuing. In response to this, the Jedi merely ran up the wall, prompting shouts of rage from the men as their guns swept up after him, but simply could not track the Master unaided. They had less than a second to finish their exclamations of dismay, the heads of the 2 gunners flying clean as he sped by them, stride unbroken.
Makes sense.
Their superior hefted a scattergun and fired it, grinning madly, fully willing to be bisected by Obi-Wan's saber if it meant slaying him in the process.
This is true.
The Jedi did not feel the same, and leapt over the man, avoiding the shredding sheets of fire and the officer entirely as he continued to run. The Imperial roared with rage and spun on his heel to discharge his weapon into Obi-Wan's back. He was cut short quite literally as the 47 Jedi following in the Master's wake swept by, dicing the man into pieces before he could squeeze the trigger. They had met the organized defenders of the ship soon after boarding. The Imperials were determined, well-trained, vicious, and ready, but none of that saved them, or even slowed the Jedi down. The Order was unleashed, and just as Obi-Wan was doing now, so too were the many other groups of Jedi that were loose on the ship, doing damage wherever they could, seeking to disable or destroy the vessel. The speed and power of their assault was utterly overwhelming, and the defenders could not stop them. In his mind, Obi-Wan could hear them, the other Jedi, all communicating to each other telepathically, reporting, updating, informing, calling for help? Someone's in trouble.
Now, here's the thing about it. This is something I was looking forward to, seeing what the Jedi would look like. And this is exactly what I expected. When people compare the two, Jedi and Space Marine, yes, I think your stock standard Space Marine would be able to go toe-for-toe with a Jedi. But they have vast differences. The Jedi is far... the Jedi would be as agile and as fast, perhaps even faster in terms of sheer raw speed. The power advantage goes titanically to the Space Marine, but every single Jedi would be every single Jedi, regardless of power, will be considered to have the same kind of power as a low-level psyker, very gamma, not really that great at all, but compared to baseline humans, it's just overwhelming. And the speed that they can move and the way that they can do things, the Space Marines, you could say, are compared to if you compare the two and just equated them to weapons, the Space Marine is basically, it's a claymore. There is no two ends about it. It's going to come in, it's going to hit you, it's going to hit you hard, it's going to go right through you. Jedi would be a fencing saber. Does the same thing, just does it in a far different manner.
Everyone said out loud, though it was his mental voice, which aped his spoken words, that was heard by the others in his group. "I sense it as well," said Master Malicos, his robed form skipping along the corridor just 2 steps behind Obi-Wan, so close the Elder Master could almost physically hear him. "It's Master Unduli," he said after a moment more.
Why can I not hear her?
Asked Jedi Knight Olgant. "Something is
The librarian.
blocking us from her, but I sense that she is calling, that she is in distress," said Master Malicos.
The librarian.
"Let us go. We are the nearest," said Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, veering left as the next intersection of claustrophobic halls came into view. No! Roared another one of the Imperial officers. They had been waiting for them, lined up this time, 4 men in front and 1 officer behind. The 4 men were holding large, glowing weapons, each one massive in their arms as they hefted, aimed, and fired.
This is gonna hurt.
The globular bolts of plasma filled every space in the hallway, melting the corridor just by their passage. They moved blindingly fast, but the Jedi had begun acting even before the shots themselves had been fired. They halted, landing wherever they could, lightsabers hung, hands extended out. The Masters and their knights focused, reaching out with their wills in a wave of force which collided with the superheated plasma. The powerful weaponized bolts smashed into the invisible wall, splattering before rolling backward on a wave of cooling but still superheated plasma, melting the still glowing corridor a second time as the men screamed. Some turning to run, forced to carry their heavy guns, the power packs on their backs which connected to the weapons, leaving them little choice.
Yeah, it's gonna hurt.
The officer screamed his fury, unloading his scattergun into the rolling wave twice before being destroyed by it. None of them survived the counterattack, and soon the Jedi were jumping from the edges of their charred bones. Booted and sandaled feet only touching the smoking remains and molten metal of the hallway for less than milliseconds as they rushed through. And so it was that things continued, with ambushes and choke points being quickly overcome by the precognitive assault of the Jedi Order and its lethal divisions. Where bullets were used, the Jedi dodged and danced around them, the Masters leading the way. Where plasma was used, the Force was deployed, creating walls which could not be burnt or expended by superheated energy. Where lasfire was used, the Jedi would rip the plates and panels away from the ship around them, sending them forward in a lethal storm of spinning metal, which would both shield the advancing knights and force their opponents into cover until the very instant they were upon them. Master Windu and his combat force had gone to a place called the Choir to neutralize their communications, and Obi-Wan and the others had lost direct contact with him, though they trusted Master Windu to handle himself in any situation. Luminara, however, seemed to be broadcasting distress, like a scream being issued from a mouth submerged by water. The closer they drew, the louder it became. Finally, they found themselves near the top of the massive vessel. A long line of carnage stretched out behind them. They had not lost a single knight, not one, on their way here. They had all been warned that holding back against this foe would mean certain failure, and a surprisingly large amount of the Order had taken this to heart. The horrors occurring on Axum had also been shared, and they had become a potent source of dispassionate rage within the Knights and Masters of the Jedi. A rage they now vented in faux serenity, faces placid as they slaughtered their way through the armsmen of the ship. Even now, they found themselves in some sort of bizarre collection of orreries, a confusing hive of domes of various sizes connected by a maze of corridors. She was within one of these chambers, but it was unclear which. But the sound of her distress had become truly alarming. They entered another orrery, the dome above them made of transparent material, and framed in stained glass which depicted different equations and constellations across the breadth of the ceiling. The stars and a portion of Axum's sphere shone in from there, illuminating the hundreds of soldiers present before them.
One of two things just happened. Either she ran into the librarian, which in case I'm surprised she's still alive, or she found the navigator, which in case I'm surprised she's alive.
Soldiers the Jedi had already sensed long before entering the room. The knights activated their sabers and got to work, moving like wraiths, each swing lopping away limbs and heads, the cries of the wounded only lasting so long before silence returned to the starlit room. This was overkill, said Master Drelig, deactivating his lightsaber as he spoke, his voice filled with bitter sentiments. Deploying the full might of the Order like this is cruel, he said, voicing the words as he would a hard fact to a stubborn student. Obi-Wan looked at Sindralig, and then they both looked towards Jedi Knight Siri Junda, who was hacking at the twitching body of an officer. And irresponsible, he added, his bitterness edging into resentment as he clipped his saber to his belt and strode towards the knight, gently but insistently pulling her away from the
Yeah, because this is dangerous. This is dangerous for them. I mean, and I understand why, but at the same time, Jedi aren't supposed to be doing this kind of stuff. They're not supposed to be engaged like this. And the sheer fact that, engaging them in the Clone Wars was bad enough, but to put them against someone in the same state of mind as the Imperium, in order to beat a monster, you've got to become one. And that's the first thought that came to my mind when I heard that the Jedi were going to be employed. When I was thinking, okay, what would happen? The Jedi would have to go to the level that the Imperium exists, and that's not a good place to be.
Corpse and bringing her gradually back to center. Obi-Wan agreed with the sentiment, though he was not sure he could agree with the idea that this should not have been done. This was only going so smoothly because they were not facing the same forces they had faced during the invasion of Axum. When they had faced armies of the Adeptus Astartes, of Space Marines. The tens of Jedi that had been present had died so quickly the retreat had not even been sounded, with few commanders having been decisive enough to survive, and none of them unscathed. Had they been here, waiting for them, then this would have been a different battle entirely.
Yeah.
Obi-Wan sighed heavily, shaking his head as he looked at the sentinel forms of the Jedi around him, and the mounds of corpses at his feet. How could it be that even in victory, he could feel defeat closing around them still? He shook his head and cleared his thoughts. His mission now was to effect a rescue of Master Unduli, and he cast his eyes and senses about, trying to see if they were any closer to her. Her presence seemed the same as it had been before, but his eyes did find something laying on the ground. A familiar shape, but one that did not belong there. A lightsaber. He went to it and collected it from the ground. He did not recognize it, but he also knew it belonged to no one within his combat force. He hooked it to his belt and turned to the others. Master Luminara is close. Let's not lose our momentum, Master Kenobi said to them. Grim nods, grimaces, and troublesome grins greeted his call, and soon they were moving again, back into the halls. Obi-Wan let his hand trace along the new lightsaber, feeling a pull within it and following. Soon they were at a new door, which led into yet another domed place, similar to the others and lit by the stars, but much larger than any orrery they had seen thus far. And now they could all hear it, not with the Force, but with their own ears. Master Luminara was screaming, her voice torn and wet, her agony slamming into all of them, as if passing into the room had been the same as passing beyond a buffer which had, till that point, smothered the truth of her cries. It was not a distress call. It was a shriek, continuous and horrid, pried from her lips by what could only be described as psychic torture. They honed in on her right away, in the very center of the cavernous domed room, writhing on the ground beneath the gaze of a massive, single figure.
The librarian.
Spread out, ordered Master Malicos.
God.
Surround him. The knights swiftly obeyed, fanning out and wrapping around as...
Is it bad to say I don't like hearing this? Like, even though 40K is my zone, like, Star Wars represents something completely different from me. Star Wars represents something completely different from me. And I don't like hearing this because, you get it. I mean, you don't want to see something like this happen. But this is 40K in a nutshell, and this universe is just not prepared for that.
As they came in from all sides. The figure was large, 7 feet tall easily, and even taller if one accounted for the rise of his metallic hood. He held a staff in one hand, a glowing, maligned thing which keened in his grip, the sound reverberating within the Force like the long, stretched-out echoes of screams long past. The dark side reeked from him. As they drew closer, they could also make out more about Luminara. Though at first it had seemed that she had merely collapsed at his feet, afflicted by unseen agony, it soon became all too clear that her arms and legs had been mercilessly crushed at each joint, leaving her physically helpless. The sight flushed Obi-Wan with rage he was forced to control, hold down. The man could smash Luminara under his foot at any moment, ending any chance to save her. No, he was no man, Obi-Wan quickly realized. He was a Space Marine, an Astartes, and whatever it was Anakin thought of them, it was clear as daylight to the Jedi present that this individual did have access to the Force. "Hey, step away from Master Unduli," ordered Seer Junda. "Slowly, carefully, or you'll get a look at all these lightsabers very close up," added Master Uvil. Obi-Wan had not been able to tell that the Marine's eyes had been closed until he opened them, the metal hood which surrounded his head obscuring the warrior's face in shadow. But once his eyes did open, there was no mistaking it. A blue fire burned there, so brightly that at first the Jedi had mistaken it for another form of augmentation. But what smoldered around the rings of his eyes was not a manifestation of technology, but an omen of true power.
Finally.
The Space Marine rumbled. Luminara suddenly went almost still, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, but no longer seized by agony, and the Jedi around them could sense the ability he had been maintaining fall away from her.
You need not fear for her safety.
The warrior assured.
She will still be screaming long after you're all naught but corpses. In fact, I swear to you all this. She will not die, not pass into oblivion, until every last Jedi on this ship has prepared the way for her first.
Brave words for a man who is surrounded and outnumbered. Master Luminara is a prized warrior of our order, but defeating her does not mean you can defeat us all, said Master Malicos. Surrender, and you shall be treated fairly. Fight, and you will be captured, and I cannot promise that you will be whole when we do it. He added, activating his second lightsaber, a humming...
You can't make these threats. You just can't.
Green blade to pair with his main-handed blue blade. The Marine said nothing for a time, and the silence seemed loud in the interim, heavy on the ear, even past the humming of so many drawn sabers. It was, Obi-Wan thought, as though the Marine was the silence, and even in this, his desire to drown them out was almost deafening, a bloodlust which ran off the Astartes like water running from a spring. And like water, it was filling the room up, subsuming the knights in an aura of menace that made the glow of their sabers seem dirtied and dull.
Do you really?
Asked the Marine out loud, clearly to no one in particular.
Think that I found your master alone?
Obi-Wan felt a cold, creeping dread slither into his guts and spine, feeling the extra saber at his waist grow unexpectedly heavy. He knew it was not Luminara's lightsaber either. It had belonged to one of the knights that had been in her combat force, knights which were not present, or so he had thought. As if in cruel response to the master's thoughts, the blue-clad warrior began to glow. Power billowed into the room through his form, like a closed door into a tranquil home being suddenly thrown open by hurricane winds. An aura of liquid gold suffused the air around him, a halo of burning, writhing energy crowning the warrior in false sunlight, like a saint of some solar religion, or perhaps its god. Indeed, the warrior seemed to swell in size as well, armor and all, becoming not only golden and shining, but even more enormous than before. Steaming rays of light which pained the eye and burned the skin erupted from the Space Marine, and the room was lit more brightly than any other part of the Gothic vessel. Jedi hesitated, flinched, and recoiled, but no attack came, the Marine simply standing where he was.
Your fates are written into the stars, foolish witches,
said the man, aiming his staff up towards the clear dome above them, further illuminating his grisly handiwork. Most did not see it at
Oh,
first,
no.
too distracted, too engaged with the warrior before them, but Obi-Wan saw right away.
Oh, no.
Plastered with great force and extreme heat into the clear ceiling above them were the smoldering, skeletal remains of the Jedi who had accompanied Master Luminara. They stared, framed between constellations, empty or dead eyes gazing down upon them all. Mouths agape and silent screams of warning, desperate but dead shouts to flee, to run, to escape with their lives.
Now, witness the glory of the Emperor.
Said the golden, godlike warrior. "Take him!" yelled Malicos, throwing himself forward.
How many of them are about to die? Okay, so for people that are in Star Wars, not understanding why I'm having this reaction, once again, I gotta say, when it comes to who I would rather win in a war, it would be the Star Wars galaxy, hands down, every single time, just because of the way that the Imperium works. But when it comes to who would win, I'm of a different opinion. And when it comes to Space Marine versus Jedi, they're pretty much evenly matched. Okay, I kind of screwed that up, but Space Marines are ridiculous. Librarians are even more ridiculous. Rant off.
"Take him!" yelled Malicos, throwing himself forward, his order at his side, Obi-Wan following as well.
Through me.
The Space Marine finished, raising his staff into the air and creating yet another blinding flash, just as the first sabers reached him. With the breaking of thunder and the scream of lightning, battle was joined.
Ah, really? Meanwhile.
"They are coming," said Jedi Master Koda. He pulled the electro-binoculars away from his eyes and handed them back to Master Voss. The Jedi took the device and aimed them down the massive main road which cut between the main spires of Azure City. Through them he could see the encroaching Imperial cultists marching en masse towards the temple. Quinlan felt a cold lump drop into his stomach and expressed the sudden anxiety with a whistle. "They really are bringing the big guns, aren't they?" he asked, eyes glued to the absolutely massive columns of large vehicles and tanks.
Lehman
From their
Russ.
position at the top of Kellenen's spire, Voss had a nearly unimpaired view of
They haven't met a Titan.
the thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers which were marching and rolling briskly towards Ayla's battlefront. Ram Koda crossed his arms, one leg up on the lip of the short railing, eyes narrowed and focused. "Yes, and everyone in the gun depot as well, from the looks of it. I think Master Windu underestimated how badly they would want to preserve that temple, or whatever it is they have inside of it. Might even be that it was their actual HQ all along," he said as Voss watched on. "Think the plan will still work?" asked Voss. Koda grinned. Ram Koda had joined the Jedi Order at a staggering 18 years of age, at the behest of Jedi Master Mace Windu. He had grown up on a desolate, war-torn world, fighting for his life since the time he could walk to the moment that Master Windu came to his world and ended the conflict. He refused to command clones. He never ordered frontal charges in all but the most closed situations, and he, more than even Quinlan Voss himself, was an absolute master of conventional urban warfare. There was no other Jedi within the Order more prepared for this kind of war, at least in the mind of Quinlan Voss. "Nothing has changed. Is the evacuation complete?" asked Master Koda. Voss closed his eyes and soon had answers to relay. "Almost. Second sweep is nearly done," he said. Koda nodded. "And the broadcast? Is everything ready for it?" he asked. Voss smiled. "Everything is ready to go, soon as you give the word." Koda nodded again, sharper this time, the movement a signal of determination. "Then it will work. They could march their own damned emperor down this road and the plan will still work." Voss gave Koda a hard pat on the back. What neither of them were mentioning, but what they were all fully aware of, was just how many of Axum's own population would die from this. It was unavoidable, and the collateral damage was bound to be enormous no matter how they conducted this battle. And yet still, both masters silently wondered if they were on the verge of stepping over a vital line, and if there would be any returning from that if they did.
Nope.
It will be worth it, Coda said, more to himself than to his contemporary. I'll deliver Axum back into the hands of the Republic, the whole world, with just this. He added, looking down into his hand at the hollow disc clutched there, and the tremendous responsibility using it would place on him. On all of them. It was making his skin itch. The voices. Were the voices really back? He had thought he was free of them, had been free of them ever since they had entered the new galaxy. Or, at least, he had been mostly free of them. He was sure. But now they were back, yes, and so many, and so confusing. Before, there had been many voices as well, but they had spoken to him, given him orders, made promises, and threats. These new voices, he could not make heads or tails of them. "Hey, Gak, hey," said Panic the medic, snapping his fingers in the Psyker's face as he did. They were all riding within the cabin of the Commissar's Chimera transport, the whole command squad seated nearby. None of them were overjoyed at the prospect of being crammed into an enclosed space with a battle psyker, but Gaxian Krell had proven himself reliable countless times, despite his admittedly unhinged personality.
For Star Wars fans, Battle Psyker is a psyker that has gone through rigorous training in order to be able to harness the warp, which is basically what the librarian is using. Now, in Star Wars universe, the warp is a lot more placid. It does exist, but it's a lot more placid because you don't have the four fuck-off Chaos Gods sitting there screwing things up on a regular basis.
Gak's eyes focused as he sat up straighter, seeming dazed for just a second before nodding his head. Yes, I'm fine," he said. Panic narrowed his eyes at that, but nodded his head slowly. As the medic of the team, he was the one person who could scrutinize Gak that way and not come off as being overly cautious or superstitious, though he was undoubtedly both. "If you say so, Gak, but you seemed really out of it just now. What's the matter? You got a bad feeling?" asked Panic. Gak paused and then nodded his head. It's the damn voices," the Psyker admitted. But I thought you said they were gone ever since...
The Jedi. He can hear the Jedi.
"I know what I said," Gak blurted, just a bit too loud, drawing some cagey stares from the standard bearer and the ordnance commander who sat nearby. "I know what I said," he repeated more calmly now. "But they're back, Panic. They're back and... weird." Panic paled a little at that, and Gak felt suddenly guilty, burdening the normal with his psychic baggage, but the medic did not back down. "Weird how? Like, skin your friends and dress in them weird?" he asked. Gak shook his head. "No, nothing normal like that. They aren't making any sense, and there are so many, hundreds at least," the Psyker said, still hearing the whispering chatter slipping and sliding over his thoughts. "Well, what is something they say? Just tell me. It can't make no sense," Panic insisted. Gak paused for a moment. 3 more on floor 812, said Gak. Panic blinked. "What?" he asked. Gak continued. "Floor 604 is clear, starting second sweep up." Panic rubbed his chin, eyes almost crossing in confusion. "Are we bringing pets or just people?" said Gak. "Okay, stop, Gak. None of what you're saying makes any sense," Panic said. "Exactly," Gak said. "It makes even less sense than they normally do, and that can't be good, not considering what's, never mind. Just, it's making me edgy," said the Psyker. He pulled his force stave closer to himself, the psychic focus glowing slightly as he did. The object should have made the whispers of daemons and the malefic dead more silent, but instead it only made them louder. Panic nodded his head and sat back. Well, I can see why. You feel like it's going to be a problem? Asked the medic. Gak shook his head.
No, I mean, maybe. But it won't be a problem for me and my abilities, if that's what you're asking. But I think these whispers bode ill.
Panic grit his teeth, hoping the psyker was wrong, but knowing well enough to understand he probably wasn't.
Right.
Gak's career may not have started off as impressive as that of some, but his accomplishments over the decades had earned him a respect few psykers could manage to attain. Ever since the Great Jump, Gak had only seemed more in control, more powerful even. But there were forces in the universe which made even the power wielded by a Primaris psyker seem minuscule in comparison. The very idea of encountering such a thing here, now, attacking the Basilica itself, was chilling in the extreme.
He's hearing the Jedi.
From the sounds of it, the daemons themselves are running their own operations, even as we run ours. Panic said, only half joking. After all, there weren't any such things as daemons, right? Gax's face did not reflect his answering chuckle, as if the possibility of that being exactly the case was far too large to discount as a superstitious joke. They rode in silence for a time then, and throughout all that time, Gax's mind seemed either unwilling or unable to release Panic's last words from his mind. Then realization struck him like a blow to the face, and his eyes widened in sudden dismay.
Stop the Chimera!
Gak yelled, shooting up in his seat, making all the passengers around him flinch back. Commissar Terrandor looked back from his command seat underneath the turret, eyes fierce as he thumbed the holster of his bolt pistol. But even this subtle act, one which would normally force any psyker to halt dead in their tracks, failed to impact Gak enough to stop him from smacking the large red button which opened the back hatch.
What in the Emperor's damned shit do you think you're doing, Gaxian? Sit back down before I put you down!
Started the Commissar, already beginning to stand up from his seat. Gak did not wait for him to finish his threat, jumping out the back of the still-moving Chimera and hitting the hard, smooth floor of the avenue with a hard thunk, stave landing right beside him. He hissed and reached for the focus, grasping it greedily and hugging it to himself, before looking up at the oncoming Chimera that had been traveling behind his own. It swerved to avoid him, hitting the leftmost elevated barrier which separated the massive suspended road from the near 1,000-foot drop to the true surface of Axum. The barrier was cracked, but held firm, though that did not stop the officer stationed inside the vehicle from popping the hatch and poking his head out angrily.
What is going on here? Guardsman, are you high?
He accused, face bright red at the sudden intrusion, clearly unholstering his own last pistol until he was able to recognize that Gak was no traditional guardsman. Gak paid him no heed at all, eyes wide, frantic, looking around, first at the vehicles and soldiers near him, and then up and away at the surrounding city spires. His act had succeeded in halting the transport column, which slowly brought most things to a halt around it. Lehman Russ battle tanks squealed and hissed as they rolled to a stop, guardsmen marching in tight, proud ranks halting to look at the commotion, Hydra battle tanks stopping their treads, even as their active anti-air flak cannons continued to sweep and scan for hostiles. But it was not their thoughts he was hearing. No, they were too weak, guttering flames in the dark of the warp, not bright enough to navigate a stream of piss to the ground, much less loud enough to intrude into his thoughts. Normally it was only the daemons who could even attempt such things, burning themselves against his mind wards and soul-binding aegis to whisper temptations into his ear. But if not daemons, and not the normal men around him, then...
Gaxian!
The psyker spun at the call, coming to face his own stopped Chimera and the enraged form of Commissar Terrandor. Bolt pistol in hand, though not raised, the man was storming towards the psyker, his eyes promising a throttling at least, his weapon suggesting worse was not out of the question.
Terrandor!
Gak said, as if only seeing him now for the first time that day. He came towards the man, arms outstretched, almost as if to embrace him.
They're right here! Right in the block!
The psyker started to say before Terrandor whipped him across the face with the butt of his pistol. Gak took the blow hard, blood spilling from his mouth and nose, leaning as if to fall,
Commissar
and then
Caiaphas
hanging
Kane.
unnaturally in the air before resuming his former posture, blood still trickling down his face and lips. But his expression, that of a man who noticed no pain save that of his panic. That, more than anything else, got the Commissar taking him seriously.
What are you talking about, Krell? Who's here?
The Commissar demanded, looking around quickly before redirecting his eyes back to the psyker.
The enemy!
Gak said, eyes wide and wild.
The toy soldiers?
Terrandor pressed, but Gak shook his head.
No, nothing so mundane. It's their masters, my lord. The masters of the Republic have come. They are surrounding us even now. They are...
Gak was cut off as the ground suddenly jumped and quaked a couple of inches, enough to shake several milling guardsmen to the ground. The planet around them seemed to start groaning under their very feet, the deep sound drowning everything else out.
What is happening?
Gak saw more than heard the Commissar say. Though he knew his response would not be heard either, he gave it anyway as he began to draw upon his power, all of his power, and all the power around him that was not his, for he knew that he would need all of it in mere seconds.
They are attacking! They have ordered the planet itself against us, and the planet is... listening!
What? New Cadia Central Command Headquarters. Nice. Oh, okay. I know who this is now.
Marshal Dovin, there is a message coming across the Xenos channels. It's planet-wide, sir.
Said the tech adept from his sunken alcove in the command center. Everything was dark there, the room lit by little more than the green hololith displays and the screens that the staff used to receive and relay orders and information. The place was bustling despite the lack of light. Uniformed bodies of both the Imperial military and the priesthood of the Adeptus Mechanicus working and moving over the wire-laden floors, clustered control panels, and the many purity seals and holy scriptures adhered onto the ceilings and walls by lavish red wax. "Nothing over the box?" asked the Marshal, standing near the center of the room, leaning over a hololithic table that showed him a display of the entire planet, lit in flickering green. Around its surface pulsed various icons, those in blue representing his forces and those in red the enemy. They had all landed near the Basilica of Salvation, something he had not expected they would know anything about. That level of intelligence disturbed him, and it, along with his broadcast, reinforced to him how little they understood the travel and communications capacity of their new enemies. The tech adept craned his head back and shook it no. "All right then, patch it through. Let us see what the softies are saying." The adept
softies.
nodded and began tapping away. Soon enough, a previously inactive hololith flicked to life and displayed the image of a man, a Jedi general, face scarred and body dressed in the battle plate of this weak republic. He stood confidently, his face composed of a determined expression which told the Marshal this message meant nothing good. "People of Axum, citizens of the Azure lineage, defenders of the Sapphire Gate into the core, we have come," he said. "We are here, in all our strength, to free you from these killers, madmen, and tyrants. The Jedi Order has come, as promised, to defend the gate. Even now we fight. We wage liberating war against the enemies of our venerable republic. Enemies which make the pitiful Confederates seem like Minox in comparison. We will fight, and we will die, but we may not be able to do this alone." The man held out the hilt of his weapon and
full-on
activated
Planet
the saber.
Rebellion.
"So I call now on you, honored guardians of the Republic, you whose lineages stretch back to those most ancient wars when all that stood between order and chaos was the Sapphire Gate at Axum. You who still honor your histories and shrines within your homes, who care for and look after weapons tens of thousands of years old. Now is the time to use those weapons again, to honor those shrines with service in place of sentiment. By the end of this day, Axum will be liberated from the Empire. Whether the credit for that liberation goes to the warriors of this worthiest of worlds, is yours to decide. Rise, Axum. The Jedi have come, and now we are waiting. The transmission ended.
This is gonna be brutal.
Contact all other installations and fortresses planet-wide. Tell them to expect heavy resistance from the civilian population in a short amount of time. Tell the—
Marshal!
cried out one of the comms officers.
Battle Group Alpha, who was heading to relieve the siege at the Basilica of Salvation, they've encountered a problem, sir.
The Marshal scowled.
Spit it out, Lieutenant. What is the problem?
He ordered. The lieutenant simply paled and attempted to speak, but only managed to mouth gibberish. The Marshal grit his teeth, waiting until it became clear the man was too flummoxed by what he was hearing to do his duty. He looked over at his second, who snapped a salute and marched over to the comms officer, knocking the man unconscious with an uppercut to his jaw and yanking the headset off of his lolling skull. She kneeled to follow him as he slumped, taking his weight as she pressed the earpiece of the headset to her ear. Though her stern expression did not change, she also seemed to lose color in her face. She barked a few orders to clarify the situation into the headset, but whatever answers she was getting were evidently not satisfying her. Meanwhile, the Marshal turned back to the hololith globe of Axum, manipulating the display to look at the line of blue icons which represented the regimental units and commanders that made up Battle Group Alpha. He felt his chest cool and then burn as, one by one, in a line leading from forward to back, the icons began to vanish from the map.
What the feck is happening out there? Report!
He barked. He looked back toward his second in command, but she simply shook her head, still kneeling as she took the headset off. There was only screaming, sir. Screaming and then silence, she said.
Grok shit!
He accused, punching the console before him, making it flicker and causing the tech adepts to flinch.
They must have said something. What was it?
He demanded. She bit her lip, but then nodded. There were 2 words I could understand, just before it was cut off.
And?
He prompted. The spires, she said.
The spires?
He asked. She nodded,
Okay.
standing straight. The spires.
Okay. Okay.
The spires! The spires are falling! They're falling onto the battle group! Sanctus Command, do you
Oh,
read?
shit.
Sanctus Command! Lieutenant Carver screamed into his Vox headset as he stared, eyes wide, at the avenue stretching out before him. The front of their entire combat force was stretched out there. Taurox and Chimera troop carriers ferrying Ogren shock troops and vaunted Traxian special forces and breaching squads, each rolling ahead of a powerful battle tank and many support vehicles. This proud spearhead was backed by the divine treads of an Imperial Baneblade super heavy tank. The thing was a literal fortress, nearly undefeatable in battle. But this was no battle. Though all the spires were shaking, collapsing, they were collapsing from the front first, falling in a wave towards the back lines. The gleaming towers of metal and glass smashed into the elevated roadways, vehicles exploding under the sudden impacts, rumbling shudders sending scores of men to their knees as more and more of the surrounding architecture continued to buckle. The avenue they were using to traverse the planet-spanning city was shattering beneath their very feet.
Wow.
A hand grabbed the lieutenant from behind, shoving him back into the Chimera. After making sure the lieutenant was in a seat, Panic turned back to face his commissar and their companion Psyker. The 2 of them were running back, though only the commissar ran into the open door. Gak remained outside. Panic took his arm, but Gak pulled away, eyes shining. "Gak, what are you doing?" Panic yelled past the clamor.
Gaxian, get your ass in here, you sorry bastard!
The commissar roared right after.
I can't,
Said Gak.
This is the reason the Emperor took the voices away. This is the reason I was here. I could not prevent this from happening, but I can save you. I can save the Imperium.
The Psyker's eyes were wide, watery, wild, and completely luminous. Panic didn't know what to say, what words to use to get him back inside the Chimera right now. And then he didn't have to. Commissar Terendor nodded stiffly. "Fine, die well, Gak, and do not fail," he said, jogging back to his
Best
command
words of
seat and
encouragement
climbing
you can
into
get.
it. Then, the Commissar said something Panic never in his wildest dreams thought he would ever hear. Terendor took the Voxcaster's microphone into his hand and yelled into it, addressing all the vehicles and guardsmen still standing stunned in their vicinity. "What are you dogs waiting for? Retreat!" He then looked back towards Panic, his customary vicious scowl fully on his face. "Seal it!" he ordered. Panic did so, almost as a reflex, hitting the red button that began to close the doors. He surprised himself, feeling moisture wet his eyes as he looked at Gax's bloody, smiling face. Was it sorrow that brought tears to him, or admiration? The medic didn't know, but he burned the image of Gak into his mind, watching with the last moments before the steel and ceramite replaced the face of his friend. Psyker though he was, here at the end, Panic knew that they had been friends, not just comrades in arms, but brothers. He felt shame fill him to bursting. Why had he never said it? Why had he never acknowledged it? Had it been his fear of betrayal, or his pride not allowing him to admit such a thing to a Psyker? Whatever it
Probably the
was,
latter.
he swore it would never hold sway on him again. Not for so long as he continued to fight and draw breath. He took a seat and strapped himself in, clasping his hands together around the holy aquila he wore around his neck, and prayed. "Emperor guide you home, my friend." Gak watched the Chimera as it pulled around, running down two fleeing guardsmen who had been too slow to scatter from its path as it drove full speed back towards the command bunker. They would not make it. None of them would. That was why he was needed, why the Emperor had placed him here. He grinned and spat out some part of his teeth, wincing as he turned back to face the collapsing series of spires. What he saw surprised him. The Baneblade was still alive. It had evidently gone into full reverse before the first spire had even slammed down, rolling over the Lehman Russ battle tanks which had been behind it, as well as literally everything else. It still was, and the Psyker watched as entire tank crews leapt out of their vehicles, throwing themselves aside and only sometimes succeeding in escaping the path of the fleeing behemoth. It was a spirited attempt at an escape, and Gak could see that the columns of smoke which poured from the exhaust ports of the tank were thicker than was normal, signaling the stress of the vehicle as it hauled itself at nearly twice its standard speed. 11 barrels of devastation firing forward into the collapsing spires as the tank rolled back, using even the recoil of its guns to boost its speed.
Nice.
But it would still not be fast enough.
But that is why I am here!
Gak shrieked. He had been gathering power all this time, absorbing the warp around him into himself, expecting to destroy his body and mind in the process. But to his shock, his utter amazement, the warp was smooth, pliant. There were sharp edges, as always, but they were dull in comparison to what he was used to managing. Temptations rose in his mind, thoughts he had rarely had himself, now rising from within as opposed to without. He shoved these whispering temptations aside with his true voice, a voice strengthened by his utter faith in the Emperor and in the Imperium.
If I am a god, then let me do this one thing, and then fall forever!
He screamed into the air, power ripping out of him, blowing the purity seals and hexagrammic wards off of his armor, and then out of his very flesh in gouts, truly jets of blue psychic fire. He was drawing in too much. He knew that, but he meant the words he spoke, even as he continued to speak.
For there can only be one true god, the Emperor, and none other. If I am a master of this power, then let me serve the Master of Masters with it.
Arcs of warp
Wow.
energy coursed through him, bright enough that fleeing guardsmen gave him wide berth as they fled the collapse. His arms spread wide as he sucked in the very last amount he could, the very limit of his limit. Then he clasped his hands forward and began to pray. With each word, he took the power he had gathered and focused it, compressed it. He felt his eyes starting to smolder, felt the rest of his teeth cracking under the pressure, but he did not halt, the pain becoming part of his power.
From the blasphemy of the fallen, our Emperor deliver us. From the beginning of demons, our Emperor deliver us. From the curse of the mutant, our Emperor deliver us. We beseech that thou wouldst bring the foe only death, that thou shouldst spare none, that thou shouldst pardon none. We beseech thee, destroy them.
E morte perpetua, Domine, libera nos.
At that final utterance, he extended his hands forward, and the power exploded out from him. The spire that would crush the Baneblade was already falling, had already begun to do so as its edge crunched into the topmost turret of the venerated super-heavy tank. But it went no further. Moments later, the tank burst from the wall of the building, which was held aloft in the air, gripped by the terrible thrall of Gak's power alone. And not just that spire. All of the spires that had been falling beyond that point were held frozen, suspended in time and space like detailed features within a massive resin diorama. However, Gak was not truly godlike, his mind only moving so quickly when burdened with such force. And so he was grateful for the staggered pattern in which the towers seemed to be falling, giving him just enough time to catch and stop one set on either side of the road before moving on to catch the next pair. The power rolling out of the man was visible only through the distortions which filled the air, as if all he touched with it were swaddled in desiccating heat. Soldiers swarmed around and past him, tanks and other vehicles narrowly avoiding him, able to see him by virtue of the luminous power which wreathed him. Many died, some shoved off the sides of the road as the ranks choked the path of the avenue, but many more were trampled and or outright crushed by their comrades or the escaping vehicles, many of which had no qualms about at least attempting to run through the throngs of guardsmen in their attempts to get out from under the enemy trap. Most vehicles managed to crash or cram themselves into each other and were abandoned or crushed as the Baneblade continued to melt itself, burning with an effort far beyond its design as it approached Gak. Closer and closer it came, making no move to veer around him, the massive weapons platform lacking the space to even try with Gak standing so close to the center of the road. Gak took a quaking step to the left, but ceased his attempt at an evasion when the buildings began to shake, nearly resuming their fall. The concentration, the focus required to keep all of this power bent to his design, it was all that he could manage without risking everything and everyone that was left. Besides, even if he were of the caliber of a space marine librarian, even then, he doubted he would have been able to do much better when it came to movement.
Right.
The power thrumming within and without him was destroying him, ripping his very DNA apart and powderizing his flesh and bone. He knew not whether he was even still intact enough to actually stand, or if he, like the towers falling all around him, was held up only by the eldritch power of his mind.
Witness my life, O Emperor!
He said, spraying sand-like shards of teeth from his lips with each
Ugh.
utterance.
Oh, God.
The Baneblade was almost upon him now, and he hoped that it would be enough, that it would succeed in escaping with the time he had bought after he was naught but paste beneath it. As it approached, it shook the ground so hard it racked Gak's body with agony, nearly throwing him to the floor.
Judge me worthy!
He cried out as the shadow of the tank enveloped him, closing his eyes tightly. But then another force took hold. A potent, though not nearly as potent, power grasped the back of Gak's tattered tunic and tossed him skyward several feet. And then again, and again. It took Gaxian several moments to realize that the source of the force lifting him was bone and muscle, and not anything so esoteric as his own strength. He squinted open his sunken, blood-filled eyes, barely able to make out the form of a blocky, exaggerated face looking down at him. The man he saw was sporting an enormous chin, a buzz cut, and two wide, black eyes filled with concern. A red bandana tied around his forehead, bearing the golden sign of the Aquila, told Gak he was looking at the face of a friend, and his mind, so near death, floundered to even begin to answer how he was still alive, or who this even was.
Sly Marbo?
The broken psyker muttered, naming the greatest legend of the guard, surely the man who had saved his life, if temporarily.
Sly?
Said the man above him, his voice deep and full of confusion.
No, strong, Runk strong, no very sly.
He said,
Algren.
even blushing at the mention of the last admission. An Algren. He was looking up at an Algren. Reaching out with his mind, Gak used some of his remaining strength to get a sense for what had happened, and what was happening, as he lay within the massive arms of the childlike Imperial soldier. As he was carried over to someone else, the wind blowing and tugging against the patches of his falling hair, Gax touched the minds around him, and was elucidated. As it turned out, many soldiers had been quite averse to being run down by the Bane Blade, as it left a bloody wake of man paste in its path, and many had chanced jumping onto it. Most had failed, but among those that succeeded was a group of Ogrins, the massive abhumans taking it upon themselves to then hang from the front and sides of the tank, scooping up soldiers and officers and tossing them up onto the body of the vehicle. The Bane Blade was so large that it took two Ogrins tossing from one to the next to get someone safely out from in front of the tank. And the Ogrins, not naturally being given over to coordination, had not kept the best track record of catching their passes, sending more than a few soldiers screaming back into the treads or careening off the side of the tank. They had managed to get plenty of practice on their way to him, however, and that had proven sufficient to save him, it seemed. Of course, Ogrins couldn't tie a knot, or untie one for that matter, so the idea to scale the tank and help others to do so as well was obviously not their own. Brunk lowered Gak to the rumbling surface of the speeding tank, and the mastermind behind the maneuver was revealed.
Kakavasaliros.
The Psyker managed to breathe. Silence, Psyker, she said, kneeling beside him, though more to keep her balance than to offer any comfort. Still, despite her words, her tone was not unkind. Runk kept him cradled in his arms, trying his genuine best to keep the rattling and shaking to a minimum. Gak could see past Runk's head, the towers falling again, but only just starting to fall, still crumbling. You have done your service, no, far above your service today, so save what strength you have, she ordered. Gak attempted a nod, but his neck cramped painfully, and it did not respond in any case. He didn't bother explaining to the commissar that it would not matter, that he was falling to pieces even then.
After all, defying a commissar is grounds for immediate execution.
He thought to himself with an inner chuckle as his mind drifted away, his very being gradually dissolving.
Only in death does there the end. Only in death does there the end. Oh, okay.
The spires evacuated, the integrity fields shut down, and the supports sliced by lightsabers. There was only one thing left to do. For some of the spires, this was not necessary, their superstructures starting to buckle and fold even as the sabotaging Jedi escaped them, leaping from windows and balconies onto nearby, stable buildings. But for most of the spires, their architecture, elegant but rugged, could and would stand for hours more before succumbing to the damage done to them. And so the knights had divided into 2 groups, each composed of little more than 1,000 Jedi each, who stood on either side of the avenue, reaching out with the Force to push on the buildings, hastening their collapse. As one pair began to fall, the Jedi would move to the next, and push, repeating the process again and again. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Altogether, the pushing was easy, and the effectiveness of their trap was obvious even before the first tower fell. The Imperials literally trampling and killing each other in their rabid attempts to escape inevitable death. And then came the disturbance. Quinlan Voss and the others had been very nearly staggered by it, and some of the younger Jedi actually lost their footing despite the lack of actual physical shaking to make them fall. A presence within the Force suddenly sprang into notice, and then swelled to such a magnitude that it left even Voss speechless, eclipsing all other emanations he had ever sensed within the Force. Such power, said Jedi Knight Khandra, visibly shivering and stepping back. Hold fast, said Ram Koda, stepping forward as if to counteract her hesitation with his own determination. Still, even Ram had a hard time masking his awe, as all the falling towers, every single one, began to freeze in midair as they fell. Nearly all were stunned, completely overwhelmed by the demonstration of power and mastery. What kind of desperation could lead to such skill? What manner of training or experience lent itself to this kind of exertion?
Yep.
Hey, snap out of it. The next one, and the next one. Whoever that is, they can't hold them all up, Voss ordered. He punched Koda's shoulder, and the master nodded. Right, keep going, he agreed. And so they did, both groups of Jedi resuming their pattern, pushing on each pair of buildings until they began to fall, and then moving on to the next, even as the power they were contending with matched them at each step. Should we push against it? Asked Jedi Knight Zubane and Konori. No, the weight of the towers will be enough. We will conserve our strength while this, whatever it is, spends itself holding the spires, said Master Koda. The other Jedi agreed, and when at last the final set of towers were made to fall, the Jedi stood in their thousands atop the adjoining spires, watching on as the rout continued. By now, all the towers were falling again, the power which held them up having finally failed, to the relief of all the Jedi assembled. Still, it had been enough for the most massive of the assembled war machines, some kind of comedically enormous tank, to narrowly escape the crushing fall of the towers and the yawning chasm which swallowed the road which fell beneath it. Many of the vehicles, including the super heavy tank in question, halted as soon as they felt they were safe, lingering in the shadow of the towers the Jedi now stood atop. Soldiers massed and turned around the rumbling hulks and support vehicles, some still running, some now milling or waiting for orders. Ram Koda and Quinlan Voss stared down upon them. So many had died, by far the vast majority of them, and yet so many remained to die still. Voss felt old instincts, callings of the dark side he had faced and barely overcome in the past, echoing within him now. Looking around at his fellow Jedi, all standing sentinel at the lip of the building, thousands of feet above their foes, he could see that they, too, struggled with the same darkness, for even the contemplation of what they must now do was a shadow on their honor. But as they stood atop that spire, Axum's sun casting their shadows long as the icy wind howled around them and tore at their robes, not a single one voiced or sent any objection. The tank first, anything that fights back after, and then everything else, said Master Koda. The Jedi, all of the Jedi, nodded and activated their sabers. For freedom! For Axum and Anaxis! For the Republic! Yelled Voss.
Oh,
the
boy.
Jedi roared in response, and as one they leapt from the spire, falling from the sky in a cascade of sabers, becoming a rain of searing, burning, and slicing death.
Okay.
The Senate sat in shocked silence, their faces lit by the soundless holographic display that played itself in obscene size and detail before them all, projected into the very center of the Senate. In each eye, human, near human, and utterly alien.
Yeah, so Rip to that Psyker. He's most definitely dead. The power of the war would have pretty much destroyed him. The power that he unleashed would have definitely destroyed him. But yeah, that's a train sanctioned Psyker for you. God, that's just bad though. You hope he didn't die for nothing, but at the same time, the Imperials are not exactly the best thing to root for if you're talking, this kind of a setting. But in any case, here we go.
Reflected the tortures of the people of Axum. The same cruelties that Hondo had showed to the Jedi now revealed in plain sight to the entire Senate. As the last of the horror-inducing displays played itself out and faded, a single floating platform carrying 2 figures drifted out to the center.
For this reason have the Jedi deployed. From disdain for the process, the decision was not made. Out of our duty as keepers of the peace did we act. To hasten you, our intention it was not. To save Axum and Anaxis is where our goal now lies,
said one of the 2, the diminutive Grand Master of the Jedi Order, Master Yoda. For a time, no one responded, but eventually some sense was collected and a challenge posed. Well, how can you assert that? You are our generals, not just peacekeepers. You cannot just... started Senator Sa'am,
yeah.
But even he lacked the strength to continue his contention.
At this point, it's best to just shut the hell up. Because nothing you say right now, like, if you're in this universe, nothing you say right now is going to make you look good in any way, shape, or form. Disagreeing with this, especially with what the Imperium's doing, no, you deploy. You deploy hard.
No, the voice of relative dissent came not from an expected avenue, not this time. This time, it came from Chandrilla's representative. I accept your reasoning, Master Yoda. I agree that something must be done, and that this deadlock aids none of us. However, I refuse to willingly cede yet more power to the Chancellorship. There must be another way, insisted Mon Mothma. And there is, said the second figure of the center platform. Padme stood, using her seat to aid her stability, clearly heavily pregnant. In normal times, the revelation of her mysterious pregnancy would have been all anyone could talk about. Now, such a detail, when put to contrast against the larger situation, inspired only curiosity from the most vain, disconnected, or mindlessly ambitious. In spite, or perhaps because of this, she spoke with a more powerful conviction than she had in the previous meetings, many of which she had missed entirely. We are not bound by one way of doing things. We need a commander who can lead this war without obstruction, but one whose empowerment does not threaten the systems of our republic. Systems which are already strained as they are now, she said. What do you suggest, Senator Amidala? Asked the Supreme Chancellor, his own platform rising from below to hover near her own. I propose we vote on an amendment to the Security Act in order to reinstate the position of Supreme Commander. And with those words, the debates within the Senate were rejoined in full. Palpatine scowled, but then, slowly, allowed his expression to melt. Perhaps, just perhaps, the young Amidala had just found the perfect way to proceed forward. It would be a gamble, to be sure, but if he could leverage this into a compromise, then it would become possible to salvage his empire. With a nod, Palpatine signaled for Mas Amata to silence the floor. My friends, I think we can all agree that the senator from Naboo raises an interesting idea for us to consider. As I have said from the start, I do not seek this position or these powers for myself, but for the good of the Republic. If it would be better served now with a shedding of some of that power, I am far from one who would refuse the act, said the Supreme Chancellor. Murmurs erupted at that. Both Senator Amidala and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine held vast and varied loyalties within the Senate. If the two of them chose to cooperate and collaborate on anything, it would be nearly impossible to stop them. Many all around the room realized with icy shock that they may very well be at the end of the weeks of deadlock which had crippled the Republic. Deadlock that, an hour ago, had seemed more entrenched and certain than ever before. However, said Palpatine, we must work out just one detail. How would such an individual be chosen? He asked. Padme smiled. She was a canny one, and knew the rhythms and flows of politics, charisma, and dealing better than most. The fact that her morality had remained so pristine was nearly a miracle unto itself, but it was also, in Palpatine's mind, a terminal weakness, for it made her predictable. Padme was in love with Anakin, was pregnant with his children, the Chancellor knew. She proposed this not only to save the Republic, but to enable aid to her beloved knight, one who was in the midst of battle even now. That meant she wanted this to be decided now, and it could be, but she would need to offer him a deal he would not refuse. I think a simple and traditional process would serve us best, she said in response. You will nominate your choices for the position, and we in the Greater Senate shall vote to recognize them. Would this satisfy the Chancellorship? Palpatine hid his smile. There it was, the offer. So reasonable, so balanced, and yet it was exactly what he needed. I think that would be more than acceptable. And in fact, I already have a nominee in mind. One I think most of us will agree would be a more than fitting general to take the position of Supreme Commander. The Supreme Chancellor said. But before that, let us call a vote on this amendment. I assume you have it drafted? Asked the Dark Lord of the Republic. Padme nodded, pressing a button on the console before her and projecting the text of the amendment before the Senate. It is right here. We can review it in detail and then vote right away, she said. The Senate murmured, but Palpatine smiled and nodded. Yes, let us begin so that we may take the vote quickly. Rejoice, my fellows. This is the fruit of our labor, the virtue of our system, he said with raised hands, signaling to his supporters where his weight lay. Several cheered, many not among Palpatine's personal sycophants, and Palpatine had to control himself not to burst out into laughter. I love democracy,
Yeah, sure.
he muttered. The microphone of his platform somehow failing to record and broadcast his sardonic musings to his many, many pawns.
Nice. Oh, wow. So this was an hour and 20 minutes long. No. Yeah, an hour and 20 minutes long. Oh, my God. Oh, yeah. This continues to get good. This continues to be good. The amount of detail he's throwing in everything is just great. I'm loving it. In any case, not a long outro here. I've loved everything that I've seen so far. I hope you guys are enjoying the commentary. Aside from all that, Creamy Sheev is up to no good, and I'll catch you guys next time.